Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Demarais. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. And Steve, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm loving it. And I didn't even shave this week, so I'm feeling good about myself.
Yeah, you got the little rugged appearance going here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, hey, we've got a very different topic today than it's not going to be about antlers or mortality or buck home ranges or anything like that. We're going to talk about, in my opinion, an issue that we're going to have to deal with as society and as deer managers a lot more often in the future. And in general, it is about ways to control urban or suburban deer populations, alternative strategies for that. And I think all the years and classes you taught, I remember some lectures that you developed about this topic. And so it's been around for a long time. It's probably just not as common for a lot of our listeners. It's not something that they deal with a lot, but it is an issue, and it will become a bigger issue over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Bronson, I remember 25 years ago at our deer study group meetings, one in particular, I remember a woman from the south of Chicago area who had attended the meeting for the first time ever. She got up in front of 300 deer biologists and said, "I'm not a biologist, I'm a homeowner, and we live in this ex-urban community, and deer are a real problem. And what do y'all recommend we do about it?" And, that kind of blew my mind because I was a deer biologist and I wasn't up on this topic very well. But then we started learning some of the University of Georgia work by Bob Warren out on Hilton Head Island, looking at it. And, so we learned along the way about it. But I'm way behind in terms of the newest knowledge. And I'm really excited that Stephanie and Jessica are here to inform us, because it's a big issue where that is a problem. And if you're outside the ex-urban environment, then it's probably not a big problem unless you just happen to hit a deer along the highway. Then it's a problem. But deer are a big problem in many situations, and this is one of the ones that in the world of hunting, we really need the support of non-hunters, and this is one of those topics that crosses the boundaries between the hunting club or group and non-hunters. And it's an issue where deer are a problem for non-hunters, and they have their perspectives, and we have to understand them. And I'm going to shut up because I'm really excited to hear what these ladies have to say.
Yeah. We're always in most situations we're dealing with, Steve. We're always going to be recommending hunting as the management tool. It is very, very effective. What we're going to hear about some today, though, is a little more explanation for why hunting cannot be the tool in some of these instances, and alternative strategies have to be brought in, different tactics in different situations. And so we're going to get educated today on kind of the latest tools and techniques for some of these situations. So two people from the Botstiber Institute. Stephanie, I'll start with you. And if you don't mind, just a short introduction and tell us about what you do.
Well, thank you, Steve and Bronson, for having Jessica and I on the show today. So a little bit about me. I've been working in the field of human-wildlife conflict mitigation for about 30 years. Been working on urban deer since about 2007, and started working with the Botstiber Institute in 2016. And a little bit about the Botstiber Institute for Wildlife Fertility Control. It was formed to educate the public, fellow wildlife professionals, and policymakers about the field of wildlife fertility control and the role that it can play in some cases in helping to mitigate human-wildlife conflicts. And what we're going to be talking about today is the role that it may be able to play in some situations to resolve conflicts, sort of part of an integrated strategy for resolving conflicts between people and deer in these urban landscapes that you and Steve were talking about.
And Jessica.
Thanks. Yes,
Hey.
I echo Stephanie in that we really appreciate being able to reach out and engage with an audience that we haven't typically engaged with before. So I hope that your listeners will find this interesting and also see that there is a little bit of overlap between urban deer management and rural deer management. I work in the capacity of science communication for the Botstiber Institute. And so I'm always looking for opportunities to network and collaborate and engage in discussions with all different stakeholders and audiences in the wildlife management arena. I have a background in wildlife, human-wildlife conflicts, wildlife damage management, and I started exploring public attitudes toward urban deer in about 2006. So been looking at those trends for, oh my gosh, I'm dating myself here, almost 20 years. So we're excited to be here today, and we can just start by talking about some of that common ground that we share between urban deer management and rural deer management. I think hopefully we can agree that we are all after the same goal. We want healthy deer populations in healthy ecosystems with little conflict. And there are a lot of differences. Of course, our rural populations are more likely to be pro-hunting. And the attitudes of our urban populations tend to fall on the side of seeking out non-lethal deer management methods. With that being said, we need more tools in our toolbox to manage the populations of urban deer. And urban deer are a little bit different behaviorally. These urban deer seek out refuges from hunting in urban areas, and they also have a lot of their needs met in a very small space. So there's not a lot of movement, mostly because they're in fragmented habitats versus a natural, open type of natural setting. But they form kind of islands, and so their behavior is actually very in line with human behavior versus rural deer, which are a little bit less open to human presence.
So, Jessica, is it this may be obvious, should be obvious to a lot of people, but let's just go through it. Is it most common that the human population, this group that has a problem and they're trying to solve it, is it more about their values of they don't want lethal control, or is it more about the safety regarding hunting? In other words, I don't care about the hunting. I have nothing against it at all. But just logistically, we don't need a bunch of bullets flying around the neighborhood.
That's a really good point. I don't think that all urban residents are anti-hunting. I would hesitate to say that, many are anti-hunting. I think that there is an attitude that hunting has its place, but as you stated, probably not in urban areas. There is a safety issue. There's also a safety issue with just the deer presence. And so I think that urban residents are dealing with a lot more, these concentrated populations where the human-wildlife conflicts are happening all the time. Deer vehicle collisions, disease spread, property damage, just having the deer in their yards or, crossing the roads is a daily issue for a lot of urban residents. But also because those residents are so close together, having something like an open hunt in that area is usually not legally or logistically possible.
Mm-hmm.
And what usually, when is there an event or types of events that finally drive people to action? I would assume, so please correct me if I'm wrong, that there's going to be a trade-off with, I like seeing some deer.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they're eating my flowers or my shrubs or whatever, I can still go along with dealing with a little bit of that because I get to see deer in my backyard or my neighborhood or whatever. Is it the deer vehicle collisions that really is what prompts action? Is it that damage or human safety issue that basically say enough's enough, we got to do something?
I think that a lot of times those metrics and those factors prompt maybe a community to gather together and say, let's discuss this problem.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure, as you've discussed on your program on this podcast, there are some carrying capacities. So there's limits to how many deer can be in an area biologically, but then there's also cultural carrying capacity. And that's really the tolerance for the presence of those deer. And there's only so much exclusion you can do in your yard. There's only so many corridors you can make for deer to cross roads safely. And so I think when somebody's life on a daily basis is interrupted and it affects them, either monetarily or it affects their time and their safety, that's when things really become an issue.
Yeah.
And we have to look at the whole, I'm sorry, Stephanie, I just want to make one more point. We have to look at the whole spectrum of residents, because there are a lot of different stakeholders within an urban area. There are people who have lived in urban areas their whole lives. There's people who moved into urban areas from rural areas. And so they have different life experiences, and they're all bringing these life experiences and their attitudes and value systems into this forum to discuss deer management in an urban area. And that's where things can get a little bit contentious. Stephanie?
Yeah. And this is a nice segue into what you just said. And that is, there are a lot of people that consider the deer that live in their communities neighbors. Like, they're part of their social network. They look forward to seeing them. They look forward to watching them live their lives with the families that they create. They actually track them. And but then you've got people that bring another set of values to the community that maybe don't appreciate them as much. And then if you're a community leader, you've got to balance the wants and needs, values, attitudes, and beliefs of all of those people. And I think one of the reasons that wildlife fertility control for urban deer became an issue is that some community leaders saw it as potentially a good compromise between, an accepted wildlife management strategy that would make everybody happy, would be a win-win if it could be done, and if it would actually address the impacts that we've been talking about, like deer vehicle collisions, browse on ornamental vegetation, and so on and so forth. So that's what makes it very challenging in these urban areas. Sometimes it's 50% are completely okay with traditional lethal methods, 50% aren't. Sometimes it's 60-40. But there are winners and losers if these communities vote one way or the other. And what they're trying to do is have options for managing deer in these areas that provide something that everybody agrees is an acceptable a way of approaching managing them in a sustainable way.
So why don't we go over tools and techniques? So, what if a community were faced with this and they were to come to y'all for education? What are our options? What are maybe your top 2 or 3 techniques and technologies for controlling deer?
And I will say that these techniques have come a long way since Steve's experience at the Deer Study Group 25 years ago. I don't know what the general consensus in the group of biologists was, Steve, but maybe you'd like to share that with us. Was it positive, generally positive toward wildlife fertility control? Or maybe there wasn't even a discussion about wildlife fertility control. Just the fact that a homeowner came and said, we need more tools in the toolbox.
Well, yeah, I think most hunters, most deer biologists work for state agencies or private landowners, and their primary concern is managing a hunted population. So I think a lot of people were interested in the topic and informed for the first time, but they thought, well, I don't worry about that because it's not in their concern box.
Right.
Not my
And
problem.
25 years ago, our deer and our human populations were a little bit lower. And so both of those populations are growing every single year. And so that is a big factor in really exploring these different options. And it's really within Stephanie's wheelhouse to talk about these latest methods and the newest science surrounding these methods.
Okay. So the first thing we ask a community, should they reach out to us about this, is what issue is it that you're trying to resolve? So we start with what the quote unquote problem is. And that's really important because if it's something that's site specific and is going to be an issue no matter what your deer population density is, we try to steer them away from population management primarily as a first order way of addressing it, because that's a pretty labor intensive and potentially expensive route to go, whether you're using lethal, non-lethal, or a combination of those methods. So we start with what is the issue and try to get them to go through sort of a really deliberate process of surveying their community to find out what the issues are. And then work towards figuring out if there are some site-specific mitigation strategies that they have tried, and if they have, how well they worked, and try to refine those to the degree that they can to see if it resolves the issue. If it does, then there's not really a reason to proceed on adding some sort of population management strategy. Does that make sense? So let's say, just for argument's sake, that yeah, the site-specific mitigation strategies are addressing some of the concerns, but not all of them. The first thing they have to ask themselves is if they want to do something that is something like fertility control. Do they live in a state where the state wildlife agency actually has a protocol for determining whether a permit could be issued for using some sort of fertility control strategy, either surgical, non-surgical, or again, a combination of those things? So that's a really important question, because there are about a handful of states in the United States that have either authorized research projects to study deer fertility control in these urban areas, or are actually issuing management permits for it at this time. So that's another really important thing. So let's say they live in a state that does. If so, there are two primary ways of conducting fertility control in these urban areas. One is surgical, and so you can do that three different ways: either vasectomizing a high proportion of a buck population, or conducting rapid ovariectomies on a large, high proportion of your doe population, or tubal ligation. So that's one strategy. Another is using some federally registered immunocontraceptive vaccines that do something to block fertilization at some point in the reproductive process within a doe. Two of those are porcine zona pellucida, also known as PZP. Zonostat D is the federally registered product. And then another one is Gonacon. Gonacon's been registered for wild cervids, wild equids, and even prairie dogs in the United States. I think I didn't mention that Zonostat D has been registered for wild equids as well. But so you can do this one of two ways, either surgical or non-surgical, and there are pros and cons and trade-offs of each of those approaches. So I don't know how much in the weeds we want to get into that, but those are the categories, and those are the options right now that are being used. Either they're being used in research projects to learn more about using these tools to manage deer in urban areas, or they're actually being used as a management tool in a couple of communities in the United States as well.
Stephanie, is it as simple as the surgical techniques Logistically, it's going to be a lot harder capturing, a sufficient number of deer. It's going to be very costly because you got the cost of capture, you got the cost of surgery, etc. But it is definitive. Once you have surgery, it's definitive. Versus some of the contraceptive route, it may be cheaper in year one, but you're constantly treating the population. So do you have to look at it over a 3, 5, 10-year window, financial investment?
Correct. So, and again, I said there are pros and cons and trade-offs of each of these. And then you add the values, attitudes, and beliefs of the people that are hiring a service provider to do this. And they may not want to do something surgical. They think it's too invasive. They don't like the idea of stopping reproduction in a healthy adult native animal. And they actually enjoy seeing the animals raise their young. So all of those are just attitudes and beliefs and values that wildlife professionals have to keep in mind, which is why one fertility control option for a community may be a good fit, given what their management goals and objectives are, and what their how this speaks to their values and how they want their deer population managed versus another. You also have to keep in mind open and closed, semi-open systems. The great thing, during the research process about surgical is exactly what you said. It's a proxy for determining whether something that was a long-acting agent would work well, because it's definitive. That animal is not going to reproduce again. So it was an interesting way to find out if you got to a high enough proportion of that population and suspended reproduction, what you would see over the next 3 to 5 years. And we've got some interesting studies coming out from places like Staten Island, where they did vasectomize a very high proportion of their buck population. And that has appeared to translate into a significant decrease in deer vehicle collisions, which was, as Jessica was talking about, one of the primary reasons they wanted to better manage their deer population there. But it has also cut the fawn rate down to, I think, maybe less than 10%. And that in turn, over time, has resulted in a significant reduction in the overall population there. So just an example of where a group of researchers went in and did this using a surgical technique. And we hope to have them publishing that data in a peer-reviewed journal within the next year. And I'm really, anxious to see exactly what happened. I'm sure some of your listeners will too, so that we can learn, okay, well, what now do we need to learn about this? What were the pros and cons, and like I said, trade-offs of using that approach as opposed to something like ovariectomies in the same place?
Do you have to... Go ahead, Jessica.
Oh, I was just going to piggyback on what Stephanie said, because when you are a community and you're dealing with an issue and exploring all of these different possibilities for reducing deer populations in a particular area, I think a lot of times you'll find that wildlife fertility control is just not even feasible in an area. Mm-hmm. But we also need to remember to bring everybody to the table, because most of those community members who are considering these options are not biologists. And right. So the education part of it is why we feel like it's so important for us to be here today. And that is the main goal of Botstiber, is to educate, not advocate for wildlife fertility control, but to educate on the possibility of that being an option for people, at least to bring it into the discussion, and to have an expert there who can fully give the whole picture of what that might look like from capture to cost, right. So that all of the aspects of your community budget and your personnel are considered in something like this.
Right. So Jessica, a second ago you said fertility control just would not be feasible. Mm-hmm. What would be an example of that? Is that just totally based on finances?
I'm going
Or
to defer to Stephanie on answering that because she has the answers.
It's a really good question. I don't have all of them, but I may be able to answer this one. So first and foremost, if you are going to use surgical or non-surgical, you have to be able to access a high proportion of that doe population. If you're focusing on the females, you have to be able to get within darting distance of them. So for a dart projector in an urban area to safely deploy that, you've got to get around 20 to 30 yards from that doe. And you've got to be able to do that with a high proportion of them. So what does that mean? Probably somewhere around 80 or 85%, if not higher. So what does that mean? This has to be a community where these animals are highly approachable and accessible. They have very little fear of the people that live in the community. They are willing to have people get that close to them, from a car or from a blind. And then you have to have roads that run through or trails that run through that community that allow a wildlife professional or a service provider access to the animals there. So from a logistical point of view, those are two of the most important factors if you're doing a site evaluation to determine whether this is even feasible. So you start there.
interesting. And as you mentioned earlier, if it's legal to use that contraceptive in the
Right.
state.
Not just that, is it legal to deploy a dart projector in that community? There are firearms bans in certain municipalities that also apply to an air rifle, which is, it's air that's, that's used to project the dart. So you may think because it's not a firearm that it would be legal to use, but in some cases they actually have to pass an ordinance in order to allow for the use of these dart projectors in municipalities.
And have you found a community that is for this type of thing to have problems getting their elected officials to pass that kind of ordinance?
Not yet. Not yet. And it's not often that it happens. I want to say one state in particular that I think it's been a bit of a roadblock is New Jersey.
Okay.
And I'm sure there may be others, but just from my own personal experience, that is one state that I know that it has been an obstacle in a few of the municipalities. I don't know if it's on the state level or the local level, but yes. But I doubt it's the only one.
Is part of the process, Stephanie and Jessica, it seems like, me looking at this, if I were going to try to assign some type of financial commitment, what is this going to cost? I'm going to have an underlying estimate of population size.
Right.
So when you're talking about we're going to have to treat whatever the technique, 70, 80% of the population, and there's this dollar amount associated with every one of those surgeries or treatments.
Right.
Is there a lot of work? Is that something the contractor, as you mentioned, is that something they do, or are they working with the state wildlife agency to come up with a density estimate, or how does that come about?
So do you want me to take that, Jessica?
Go for it.
So two things. It's really important if a community is going to start a deer management program. So I hear you all say on the podcast very often, you cannot manage what you do not measure. So starting with baseline impacts, go back to where we started. Why are you attempting to manage your deer population? So before they do anything, they should be working with a professional to measure the impacts that they have now that they believe are associated with their current deer population. And then, yes, they should be having a professional determine what the population density is at that point and collecting any data that would be relevant to doing any form of population management at all. So you know where you're at. And then in a very deliberate, thoughtful process, try some site-specific mitigation strategies to see if you can move those impacts towards an acceptable level. And then if you can't, then start thinking about how a population management tool of some kind might be able to get it closer to what the acceptable level is. And of course, we have to agree on what that acceptable level is. We need to know what success looks like and not just think about it sort of in a sort of esoteric way. There's got to be some sort of benchmark that you're creating for yourself as a community that you're working towards, whether it's a survey that people feel like that their issues are being resolved with what's being done now, or they could be better if they did more, something like that. But there's got to be a way of measuring how you're doing so you can continue to refine your program over time.
Stephanie, could you clarify what you mean by site-specific mitigation?
So it could be something as simple as treating ornamental shrubs with a tried and true repellent to keep the deer in the area from damaging it. Exclusion methods like fences or some of those netting devices that people will put on like pansies and hostas that are like candy to deer in a lot of the United States. Those are some of the things that I'm talking about. But it could even be deer vehicle collisions. What if there is a hot spot in that community where deer vehicle collisions exist, and there's something site specific that you could do to mitigate for that, like putting up signage that only lights up when a deer is approaching the road, that would get driver behavior to change, that would reduce the number of deer vehicle collisions during the rut or something like that. Public education during the rut, letting people know that daylight savings is coming, which means rush hour is going to coincide with crepuscular animals that are going to be most active at that time. That's when we see spikes in those deer vehicle collisions. Those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about when I say site specific. People tend to, I won't say people, communities sometimes think, yeah, that's great, but well, no, let's really talk about what you could do, because that's a lot cheaper and more effective potentially than immediately going to managing populations, whether it's lethal or non-lethal. So like to start there and then work our way back to whether or not management of the population itself is needed. And even that, probably you're going to have to think about where you could do it, where it would have the most impact on these issues that you're attempting to resolve with your management plan.
Right. And I think it is important to note as well that this is not a silver bullet. Wildlife fertility control very infrequently would be used alone. So it would be part of an integrated management approach. And that is something communities should know, that it's a tool in the toolbox for possible use if all of the logistics and the costs coincide with what a community wants for their deer populations.
And so by integration, you're meaning simultaneous to the control, also
Yes.
exclusion.
Correct.
Also the other things that Stephanie were talking about. And
Correct.
even potentially, I don't know if there's ever been an instance of this, but even potentially, if it were a big community, on the periphery of that community, having lethal control,
Correct.
hunting.
And that is sharpshooting. Lethal control is a technique that is often used in conjunction with wildlife fertility control, even now in some of the current projects that are ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Is that to drop the total number down a little bit before you start trying to do the more intensive efforts, Stephanie?
It depends. Again, remember, in a community where they do not want lethal at all, it's kind of a non-starter for them. But there have been some communities that can be done one of two ways. You can either go in and do fertility control first, tag those animals so that they know that they've been treated either surgically or non-surgically, so that if you have sharpshooters come in afterwards, they know which animals not to target, because there's been an investment made in those animals already, and you don't want to basically remove that investment by mistakenly taking them, So it can be done one of two ways. There have been some biologists that have thought that because you have to get so close to them with a dart projector to treat them, whether you're doing surgical or non-surgical, that there may be some benefit to doing that first with animals that are clearly approachable enough and accessible enough to do that. And then for those animals that are much warier of being around people, that aren't going to get within 20 or 40 yards of a dart projector, and 40 is stretching it. It really is typically between 20 and 30. That those are animals that you would not have been able to surgically sterilize or treat with an immunocontraceptive vaccine anyway. And so, but if you waited to do that afterwards a lot, and you've done a controlled hunt, those animals you may have been able to get close to may become wary because they've just had a lethal program of some kind that was conducted in that community. This is just speculative. There's still so much that we need to learn about it, and I'm really hoping some of the listeners that are researchers are letting the wheels spin in their heads on what has not been done yet to study this as a field of urban wildlife or deer management. So we're not sure yet, but that's something that's just starting to happen. Again, as I said, management, it's only legal as a management tool in a few states. And in those states, we're starting to see an uptick in the number of projects that are being conducted. I'm really hopeful that in addition to doing management, they're keeping data and will be able to publish papers on what they're doing. So maybe we'll get some answers to those questions, Steve.
Right. And for those listeners that do have questions, or maybe there's researchers out there that would like to communicate with Botstiber, our information, I'm sure, will be in the show notes to reach out to Botstiber and talk about possible collaborations. That is a big part of what the Institute, a big part of our mission is working with researchers. So
I could imagine if you were if you were asked to give a presentation. So let's say a community is considering this and a lot of different options. I would imagine that part of your presentation would be, we're going to show you a scenario to where here was the problem and here's how we solved it. These are the different tools we used and this was the end result. And you might also have a scenario where you say, there was still the same problem, but because of this, that, and the other, it was not effective. Could y'all maybe go through some instances, whether it be in the U.S. with deer or maybe another animal in another place, but where it worked, it was very effective, and this is why it worked, or it did not work, and here's why it didn't work?
I'll take the where it didn't work in a Midwestern city. I won't name the city, but I think the enthusiasm for using wildlife fertility control was there. There was community and stakeholder support, which is big. That is something that we really need in order to try to employ something like wildlife fertility control, open-mindedness, support. However, that community did not do long-term planning. They looked at the next year's budget. And so that is what they used to employ 1 year of wildlife fertility control. And so there wasn't the long-term strategy involved with that. And admittedly, from those community members, that was the takeaway. It did not necessarily decrease the deer populations because it was not implemented in a way that took into effect a long-term strategy. So Stephanie knows of a project that I believe is still underway that has had more success.
Right. So some of the early studies that were done on places like Fire Island, Fripp Island, Bald Head Island, I'll use Fripp and Fire as an example. Those were closed systems, and that was good because you're removing a major variable to start testing this. And this was back in the late 80s, early 90s. And they were able to suppress population growth on those islands. I think Fripp was particularly effective in that they were able to drop the population by 50% in maybe 3 to 5 years. Then studies started to be conducted on the mainland and built out areas in places like New York. So Hastings-on-Hudson is one project that we think there'll be a paper coming out about soon. They were able to show a reduction in in fertility in a high proportion of the does that they treated there. I also already talked about Staten Island doing a surgical sterilization project using vasectomies on bucks. But before that, there was a paper published in 2021 by Di Nicola on, I think, 6 different states where they had done rapid ovariectomy projects. I'll try to name the states, but it was as varied. It's like California, Virginia, Maryland, New York, Ohio. I think I'm missing 2, but these were all, except for one retirement community in, I believe it was San Jose, California. All of these were open systems, but they're open, but they're built out. And what I mean by that is they are completely developed. So there's little chance that development is going to cause the deer population in that area to be disturbed in some way that would cause them to move. And we know that does generally in these urban areas, if they have what they need, food, cover, water, they don't tend to stray more than a mile from their natal territory. And so if they have what they need, they tend to stay where they are. And so even though these were open systems, they were, from a deer point of view, maybe they were closed because they didn't have a reason to move. And if they aren't being hunted as well, again, not a reason to move around much. The bucks are moving around. You have the odd doe that'll go on a walkabout, but they tend to stay where they are. And if it's the doe population you're focusing on, there's not a really good reason to believe that if you either surgically sterilize her or treat her with a reversible immunocontraceptive vaccine, that they're going to stray very far from where they were born. And that same goes for their offspring.
And I think that is an important point to make as far as the development of these products. The holy grail of wildlife fertility control would be something that is cost effective, that also does not change behavior of the animal very much. So we want them to still engage in the same behavior that they have been engaging in, because we don't want that chemical to make physiological changes for them besides either not fertilizing an egg or not reproducing from the male standpoint.
And that may be a plus to using an immunocontraceptive that a community may value. Mm-hmm. So if they want these animals to continue to act like wild deer, they may not want to do something like an ovariectomy. That's one of the benefits of the vasectomy project from that standpoint, is that the bucks continued to act like bucks. They were just shooting blanks. And so that was something that for Staten Island may have been beneficial, but it also may have been strategically beneficial for what it was they were trying to accomplish, which was having those dominant males continue to defend does that were intact, but they were probably mating with them, but they weren't getting them pregnant. And the data seems to play that out, that it worked quite well. But, and I don't think we've talked about this, one of the logistical parts of this that's really important is that with these programs, once you decide to do it, let's say you've hired a wildlife professional, a service provider to do this for your community, and you've got the state's permission to do so, they have to front load these programs. You can't, otherwise you're constantly playing catch up with the birth rate that you allow to occur. So if you're going to do one of these programs, the service provider has to have a plan to get to a high proportion of his target population or her target population within the first year or two. Otherwise, the animals that remain intact, untreated in the population will continue to have young, and that will keep you from having an impact on the deer population growth rate.
And I'm sure that'll, obviously, it depends on the productivity of the deer herd.
Absolutely.
So what we would say rate of increase or population growth rate. But generally, Stephanie, is it like you got to start out by treating at least 50%
maybe higher. And that's why managing what you're measuring is really important. It's hard for a service provider to come up with a plan on how many animals they need to try and get that first year to really get on top of suppressing the population growth rate if they don't know how many there are to start with. They have to have a goal of how many they're trying to get that first year, and then hopefully the second year, if they're right, and they've done good surveys ahead, before and after. Remember, they're tagging their animals. They're doing something to mark them in a way that makes them conspicuous that those are treated animals. They're hoping that the next year and the year after that are just maintenance years where they're getting some of the animals that they missed the year before, but they feel confident they get a high proportion of them the first year.
Is there ever a strategy for, so I've heard you mention, treating the bucks and treating the does. Is there ever a strategy? Is it like a situation where you look at the problem and say, based on these herd characteristics or the situation we're in, it's going to be better to treat the females versus the males? Or is it more about the contractor, service provider that's close by? They're an expert in this technique, and so they're going to treat the bucks.
Right. That's a really great question. And I think that I can't answer that question, but I think we will learn a little bit more about that from the papers that are going to come out on the Staten Island project, because the same service providers and researchers that are currently conducting that project for New York City, they are the ones that published the paper on the 6 sites where they did ovariectomies on the does. And so I hope in that paper, they'll discuss in the methods the decision to, or in the intro and the methods, the decision to try vasectomy in this particular species and context rather than rapid ovariectomy, which is something that these researchers had implemented and continue to implement at some project sites for both management and research around the United States.
And I think too, and this is great information that comes out as a result of doing this research, when the population estimates are done on an area, the sex ratio is also done. And that is probably another consideration in treating the does versus treating the bucks.
Yep.
And that's information that hunters can use too. So much comes out of the research that can be used by land managers who may be, managing for populations in rural areas, the movement, the behavior, sex ratios. So I think that there's a lot of overlap there from working on these wildlife fertility control projects into land management in rural areas.
And Jessica, I'm really glad that you mentioned movement, because those same researchers are going to be publishing some work on deer movement in Staten Island in response to the fertility control efforts that have been done there over the last almost 9 years, I want to say now.
Wow.
I believe one of the researchers just finished defending their dissertation recently on this work. And so that's another set of information that we have never had before on using this in an urban system. But I would say, remember, even when they publish that data, it's going to be specific to Staten Island and to conducting vasectomies. You're not going to necessarily apply what they learned to an ovariectomy project done on a truly open system. So that's, and I've heard you all say it on the podcast many times. Yes, we can make connections from one to the other, but each of these is super case by case. And so you can't necessarily apply it to each and every situation.
Right. I think some of the bigger take-home messages, like in that Midwestern town, long-term planning is very necessary on the front end of considering wildlife fertility control. And that's a very important takeaway, I think. In terms of learning that, there was some success in that there was information that could be passed to other practitioners who might be considering this option.
Right.
And so maybe we segue into what success looks like.
Yeah,
because there's a lot of similarities, interestingly, between success in managing deer for hunting populations and managing deer in urban population. So we're looking at population suppression or decline, maybe improved ecological balance, or the return of vegetation in some areas, community support, and enthusiasm for that type of management tool. Reduce conflicts, of course, is a big one. So those all apply to every management tool. We're really using different tools in the same toolbox. This isn't a one or the other.
Right.
And it seems like it would have to be, I'm sorry, Steve, I'll be real quick. It seems like it'd have to be critically important to have a standard set up front of let's define what success is going to be.
Yes.
Right.
And then, you hit that or you don't, or hit the mark or miss the mark. But like I can just envision the project Stephanie's talking about. That had to be expensive.
Mm-hmm.
For what, almost a decade, all of the capture and the surgery had to be expensive.
Long-term cost effectiveness would definitely be a success metric.
But I could see how the population of humans, them being divided, and that some people saying that was very effective, and some people go, yeah, it was effective, but man, it wasn't worth that monetarily. So I think you got to get agreement up front that this is what it's going to cost, and we project, what the effectiveness is going to be, and get everybody's opinion on paper that we all agree, that we're in this together. Transparency
and education would definitely be two main factors in this type of tool. Steve?
It seems like it's you're up against a big berm to get over, because these people that moved into those communities with lots of green space because they like to be in that kind of environment, and they like to see deer. Oh, look at the beautiful deer. I love to see deer. But when it becomes a problem, when it's over that cultural or social carrying capacity, and you have damaging issues, and I know in the Northeast, the Lyme disease is one of those hot button topics that stimulate interest in this. But then you've got different people within the community that come from a hunting background. They don't mind deer being harvested, and then others have an economic background. And hey, I can't spend so much money. Boy, it's like a herding cats, is it not?
It's a very complex issue.
It is. And one of the things that the Botstiber Institute for Wildlife Fertility Control is working on with some partners is to create a decision support tool that's a bioeconomic model for urban deer management that will allow communities to see over 5 to 10 years different returns on investment of different approaches to managing their deer population. It's going to be pretty sophisticated. We're hoping to have an interface that's for laymen, community leaders that aren't biologists, but certainly understand the pros and cons and trade-offs of one approach versus another. If somebody is able to plot the data out that they've collected on their particular deer population and what they might be able to project over time, what it would cost to manage them using different integrated strategies, right? Including maybe some population management as well. But it's also going to have a research interface for researchers out there that are interested in learning more about this field and where the research gaps are that they could actually use to test the work that they do in the field on urban deer. And that's probably the thing that we're most excited about, is being able to provide that as both a decision support tool for communities and a research tool for researchers that are interested in getting more involved in filling some of those gaps.
That sounds like a great tool to produce.
We hope our partners are successful in doing it. We're pretty excited about it.
Okay.
I remember, one last little thing I'd like to talk about is I'm familiar with like Fairfax County in Virginia, and y'all probably are too, and probably more accurately informed than I am. But as I remember, it's just outside of the Washington D.C. area, and there's a lot of homes and urban areas with lots of green space because there's lots of hills and therefore creeks and wetland areas, and so that demands green space, and people love to move out into there. And those green spaces became county parks. And those county parks implemented probably 20 or 25 years ago uh, an approach where they were essentially leasing out these park lands to groups of bow hunters, archery hunters that had to be up in a elevated tree stand and shooting down, so it would reduce the safety concerns. Um, what's the latest on those kind of approaches, and are they growing, or did it hit a dead end?
Jessica, do you want to take that one? I may not be as familiar with it as you are.
Well, the Fairfax, Virginia scenario was several years back, and yes, bow hunting was part of their population reduction plan for the deer. I think as communities get a little bit tighter, and in those communities where those parks are not large enough maybe to have a bow hunt implemented, it's just not an option. There's a lot of community outcry about public safety, but then also about the humaneness. If, let's say, a deer that did have an arrow in it ran into somebody's yard and collapsed there, just the visuals, the optics of that produced some community resistance to bow hunts. I think the other factor in that was, how do we vet these hunters? Because it became a cost issue there too. There had to be staff available. We had to make sure that these hunters were proficient in using their bow, and monitoring that became a little bit more time and cost consuming than some of the communities wanted to do.
The other thing I would say, Steve, is we have to also measure whatever management efforts we're making against whether or not it's actually addressing impacts. And so I don't know if they, because this tool that we're trying to put together doesn't exist yet, that we know of. Maybe it does. That would be great. But I think that's the key to this, is whatever integrated approaches you're using, it would really be great to have a tool that you can run it through to say, okay, we may be having archers use this as an opportunity for recreational hunting, but given what we know about deer ecology, is it actually having an impact on the issues that we're trying to address with our cumulative deer management plan? Maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. I'm not saying that it's not, but I'm saying anything that we attempt to do, whether it's site-specific or focused on the population, that we should have a way of evaluating whether or not it is actually addressing the concern that has prompted a municipality to create a plan in the first place.
That's a great point.
It's almost like a community needs to invest probably 5 years of research into the deer herd in terms of dispersal and colonization and fawning rate or recruitment, etc. Maybe even a little movement component of it,
right,
to really understand the dynamics of that herd, and then you could apply.
And
you
many
would be
states,
most efficient at applying control.
A lot of states have that information. The state agency is the level at which you would have to get the permit anyways. A lot of those states, and as urban biologists become more common, as we crank out our wildlife professionals from different universities, urban biologists it's commonplace now for our students to take jobs in urban areas, even if they do work for like an agricultural agency. They might be dealing with urban areas. So a lot of that information is available and should be integrated into some of the metrics that are collected every year from those deer populations.
And I'll go back to Steve's point. If you're a community leader, you're in a real pickle, because you've got all of these people with different, as I say, values and attitudes about these animals that are asking you for completely different things as it relates to the deer. And so the idea of waiting 5 years to make a decision for people that are already saying we need you to do something about this now is hard. But again, if there was a decision support tool that had a good way of explaining to fellow members of their city council or their community board, as well as all of their residents and members, as to why it's going to take 5 years. Maybe people would be more patient and give them the time to compile the data and the information they need to make a well-educated decision about how to proceed.
Stephanie, I know this is it's not meant to be a difficult question, but I know it would be difficult to answer.
Okay.
And this is as much of a it depends type question as you're ever going to get. But this is the equivalent of saying, how much does a truck cost?
Yeah.
And someone said, well, how old's the truck? New truck, used truck? You know, what make, what model, etc. Just to give someone a realistic number, the cost of entry. In a very normal scenario, would a community have to budget for a minimum? Is this a $50,000 a year entry fee? $100,000? I mean, give people just some idea of what we're talking here cost wise.
Right. So it depends on the scale and scope of the project. So obviously, if you're talking about a property owners association or a homeowners association, it's going to be different than a township or even like a county, like the county that Steve was describing earlier. It would probably be a community within a county like that. So what are we talking about? Maybe 50 target deer in a community. And I will say, a community like that is more representational of the type of communities that reach out to the Botstiber Institute and others for information about how to get started, to even start thinking about this. So let's use one of those, because that is what I would consider to be representational. So maybe you've got a population of 100 animals, and if the sex ratio is 50-50 and you decided to target the doe population in this case, you're looking at, for surgical sterilization, I think that there is some published data suggesting if you're hiring a professional and you're not using volunteers to offset some of the labor costs associated with it, you may be looking at somewhere between $500 and $1,000 a doe. But remember, it's definitive, meaning you're done. Unless there's a huge amount of immigration or emigration in and out of that system by those does, those animals are your community deer population. And they're more than likely not going to leave. I don't want to say they serve as placeholders, but there is some indication that because they remain in the area, it could prevent a swift immigration of other animals from another community or the surrounding areas. Yeah. So that's just an idea, because I know that there's published data on that. But I think that paper actually suggested ways that communities could bring that number down if it was really something that they wanted to do. But I think you also have to compare that to the amount that a community would have to pay in order to have a professional service provider come in and do a safe sharpshooting program. I know that there's a community in Northern Virginia that is about to pay $150,000 to have a professional group come in and remove deer via sharpshooting. Well, the problem with that is, and if there's nothing to make that area unattractive or inaccessible to those animals, and you're not stopping the population growth rate or slowing it down by going in and doing fertility control on animals that survive, that population is going to rebound within a few years, and they're potentially going to have to spend, if they decided to do it again, another $150,000, maybe more, to do it all over again. And so that's why we think having a decision support tool, so people understand before they make this decision, when they start trying to manage populations in these urban areas, that it's not one and done, no matter which method you're using, that it's something that you're going to have to create a line item for in your budget in perpetuity. And that it's the cost of living with deer.
And the $50,000 cost sounds maybe high, but when you relate that to cost of a new vehicle being totaled, That vehicle may have
I
cost
didn't even mention
50,000.
that part. You're right.
Right.
And
Or
maybe
if
that's
you
why,
have a
or a
well, if you
human
have a
life.
partial,
I mean, a
yeah,
human
a
life.
partial vehicle damage, but a human life
Hmm.
lost or serious injury. You know, I used to in my classes, I had this terrible photo that I would show of a vehicle with a buck whose head was slid, went through the front window, and his body was on the inside, and his head was on the outside, and there was a kind of little old lady in the driver's seat, just kind of crushed by the deer.
Mm.
I
Right.
mean, those things happen.
That's right.
Right.
What's the budget cost for that line item?
Right. Right. And there are insurance companies that are getting very interested in ways, for instance, these hotspots, these deer vehicle collision hotspots in various states where the deer vehicle collision rate is particularly high, trying to figure out ways to work with both the state wildlife agency and the transportation department to do proactive measures to make those areas safe for both wildlife and drivers. And that's why there's such a push to create these overpasses and underpasses where they make sense, where we know it's a hot spot that isn't going to be resolved by doing a couple of controlled hunts. That with the deer that are there, there is something inherently attractive about that place that makes it a crossing area, and that investing some time and figuring out why, and then figuring out something site specific to do to mitigate for it is probably a better, use of time and resources.
And this is where the biology can be a little counterintuitive, or maybe the logic can be counterintuitive, is that when animals, and deer don't do this to a great extent, but they do it somewhat in terms of territoriality and defending a home range to some extent. I can see where a lot of people would go, you can't tell me that it's got to be cheaper to come in and use lethal control and get rid of them. But the reality is, like Stephanie, what you just mentioned is that may be true in year one. It may be cheaper
Right.
for the lethal control year one, but if you have good habitat there, other deer are going to colonize. And so now you're doing lethal control every single year.
Right.
Whereas if you went with fertility control, it might be a much greater cost year one, but now you have adult male and female that are defending a territory and serving as a placeholder in that population and not reproducing. So if you stretch that out over 5 or 10 years, the fertility control may be more economical.
Could
Right.
be. And there's some places, I've heard Tony DiNicola say this from White Buffalo, and they're a service provider, that there's just some places that hunters can't get into. In these spaces, that's where wildlife fertility control can really help to control and sustain these populations.
Well, Stephanie and Jessica, I know there's a significant number of our normal listeners that are just hunters that live in communities like you're talking about, or have family members that live in communities that you're talking about, and they're going to listen to this show and they're going to say, I think my community needs to reach out to the institute
Absolutely.
and learn.
And that's what we're here for. We're here to educate and to inform people about this as a viable option, because in some instances it will not be, but there could be
Absolutely.
some where it will be. And even in Mississippi, I mean, you think of Mississippi being rural, but as you get closer to Memphis, there are a lot more urban areas. And there were a lot of discussions about what can we do about these urban deer
Right.
populations. So it happens all over the United States, and it would be great if all of the options could be part of the discussion, and that's what we're trying to promote. Not necessarily wildlife fertility control, but the discussion of this tool as an option.
Well, I think it's a great organization, and it's really good to have an institute like this that provides science-based, non-biased. Again, you're not selling a product.
No.
Your goal is education, unbiased information, so communities can make the best decision. And that's
Correct.
a heck of a lot better than just finding the answer on Facebook. So thank you all.
Yeah,
Thank you all for
it's
doing
not a
this.
Google. You don't want to
Yeah.
Google this option and find the answers there. So please reach out to the Institute if you do have questions. And we really appreciate the time on this podcast.
And we'll put the Institute and whatever contact information y'all are willing to share, we'll put that in the show notes for people so they can reach out to you directly and ask any questions.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you
Okay.
both.
Thank you,
Thank you,
guys.
Stephanie. Thank you, Jessica. Enjoyed it. Thank you, Steve.
See you
you
guys.
soon, buddy. All righty. Bye-bye.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.